Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our free tutorial today, we're going to work on a beaded spike weave shield pendant. So I've gone with some beautiful, vibrant green dyed onyx beads, which are faceted. They are really sparkly, pertinent any time of the year, but I think at this time of the year exceptionally so. Let's take a closer look at the project and then we'll make one together. This is the beaded spike weave shield pendant. Now to create this piece we're going to use a couple of different techniques. We're also going to be using a number of different wire gauges. I've worked in mixed metals on this piece so that you can easily differentiate what part goes where. I've also chosen to work with some dyed onyx beads, and they are 6mm faceted rounds. This design works really beautifully with bicones as well, and again around about a 6mm would be the ideal, but you can mix and match how you feel fit. So the reason it's called a shield pendant is because it is domed, and the centre sort of sits forwards and more proud, as you would imagine the centre of a shield to sit. I'll also be dropping some links into a detailed video on the spike weave and a detailed video on the Loki Bale. So those are a couple of things that you can add into this technique. I will be running through the basics of spike weave in this video, but if you want a deeper dive, there's a link to the spike weave videos 1 and 2. So let's just pop that up in the corner for now. Now our first gauge of wire is 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire. You can equally use a 1.5 or a 1.6, which is approximately a 14 gauge wire. Now I have a 12-inch length here to work with, and I'm just giving that a smooth just to make sure that it is as straight as it possibly can be, as once you've started applying the spike weave to this main section, it's very difficult to then be able to straighten it out. Now in terms of the tools that I'm working with today, standard bent chain nose pliers and good quality flush cutters are a must. You can either create your own pins, as I have done here. These are 4-inch lengths of 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire, and I've just put a little hook on the end because it helps me to just keep things under control. Now these have been used over and over again for spike weave, so they've become quite firm. The other alternative is to use steel rods. I'll pop a link down below the video to show you how you can get some of these for yourself if you want to do a lot of spike weave. It's really helpful. So these are stainless steel rods. They're around about 4 inches in length, and they're about 1.25 or 1.3mm across. So I'll just pop those down for a second. The second wire that we're going to be working with today is 0.6mm gauge wire. I've just got some silver plated copper core here, which is equivalent to approximately 22 gauge. We're looking to generate our section of spike weave in the middle third of our length of heavier 1.25 or 16 gauge wire. I've just switched out for some copper because it's showing up better on my camera for you. So if I lay around about 1.75 inches just over the point at which I'm a third from one end, and what I need to do is to get 4 really neat tidy wraps around that core wire. We're going to call this wire number 1. Now let's trim away that end section, and then we're going to make sure that the end of that cut wire is nice and neat and tidy. So you can see there's a really big sticky uppy bit there. Let's get that rotated around until it sits down flat and flush. Make sure that's nice and tidy and that you have just got the 4, so you can undo that a little bit should you need to. To tighten up a coil, if you pop one side of your pliers at one end of the coil and one side of your pliers at the other end, you can just compress that little spring of wire so that the weave is really nice and neat and tidy. And again, we're in the middle third. You may hear some scratching on the work surface of the tail of wire. When you're working with long bits of wire, that does tend to happen. So I'm quite happy with how that's looking. I'm just going to turn that to the side as it might be easier to show you what's happening. So I'm just going to smooth this wire through. It's been a little bit chilly here today, so the wire is a little bit uncooperative. So again, this is 0.6mm or 22 gauge, and it's connected to the reel. We're going to bring in our first rod. As I mentioned, you can get yourself a steel rod or you can use a piece of copper wire in the same gauge, approximately 1.25. I'm going to bring the rod up to that first section of weaving we've created, and you may need to just move this around until it sits how you want it to sit. Visually, it's easier if I pull it over like so. Take that tail of wire round and underneath, and what I don't want to do is to pull this so tight that there is no space between our core wire and my first rod. What I'm looking to do now is to wrap twice around both that core wire, our frame, this is going to be our frame, and that first rod. So if I just scooch that up really neatly and tidily, you can see there is still a gap just here. Draw the wire around again and then all the way down to the rear side. Now I'm not going to bring it all the way down to the bottom, because what I want to do now is to bring that tail of wire up between my frame wire and my first rod. So push that so that it sits really tight up against the preceding wrap. Give that a really hearty squish to make sure that it's nice and tidy, and then pull the wire upwards. So we're building upwards. We've started with a wrap of 4 around just the frame wire, and then I've wrapped twice around the frame and the first rod. Let's bring in the second rod and hold it in approximately the same place. So that's just going to sit above the rod beneath it. I'm going to do basically the same thing, which is to wrap twice around 2 wires together. In this case, the 2 rods that I have in position. So all the way around, but bringing the tail up above the frame wire and below rod number 1. Pull that up and tight against that preceding wrap. And because you're working with a very firm wire, 0.6 may not feel like a very firm wire, but when you're wrapping in this fashion, it really does get a little bit firm. Now you can make this design with 0.7mm gauge, which is just a little bit trickier to get hold of, but it does make it a little bit more firm. You can also make it with 0.5, which is a 24 gauge, but you're slightly weaker on that final freestanding spike weave. Because this is supported, you can make it with that 0.5 if you want to. It's just a little bit easier on the fingers. So again, taking that wire up, we're kind of building and building upwards. Draw the wire down and then bring it up now between the first rod and the second rod. So you've got 2 wraps around each section. Bring the wire up and away, and you can see we're starting to build almost a series of steps going upwards. So you're going to continue doing this all the way along until you have all 4 rods or wire sections in position. So I'll just show you this once all the way through and then we'll move on. So all the way around 2 rods at a time. Pull that all the way down, all the way around the front side. You're showing that you're covering 2 rods, and then you bring the tail up between the number 2 rod and the number 3 rod. Push that up and into position. Scooch it over to the side with your pliers and then bring that wire upwards to add in that final rod. So you're looking to build 4 rods above your frame wire. So sit those side by side, get them nice and neat and tidy, and then we'll wrap twice around the uppermost 2 rods, over the back and then down. Now because this is the top rod, we're not going to be coming up between the top one and the next one down. We're going to come up now between the number 1 and number 2 rod. And that's so that we can create a wrap like we're coming down the other side of a mountain. So hold those rods in position really firmly. You can, if you want to, put a little vise over the end there, or you can use a ring clamp just to hold everything together. Once you've started, it'll feel a little bit more steady, and you will need to remove that ring clamp after your first couple of weaves. So on the downward stretch now, we're going to wrap around the number 3 and number 2 rods. Scooch that up nice and neat and tidy. And again, coming up between 1 and 2 rod, pull that all the way up. Repeat the same design so you come down between the 3 and 4 rod. So on the front of your design, it looks like you've wrapped around those 2 wires, all the way down the back for a second, scooch everything over to the side, keep it nice and tight, and then we're going to bring the wire up now between the frame wire and the number 1 rod, so that we can wrap twice now around those bottom 2 rods. That's rod 1 and rod 2. We're going to wrap around. I've gone slightly too high there, so you can pull that out as soon as you see it. We're looking to wrap around the number 1 and number 2 rods. So bringing that wire between the number 2 and number 3. And you'll see immediately if that's sitting in the correct position. Scooch that over. You might need to add a little bit of tension. And then bring that wire up between the frame wire and that number 1 rod. Scooch that all the way over. Bring the wire down between 2 and 3 again. And you'll see whether it's right just by looking. So we've got 4 wraps around the frame, and then 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. And now we need to do 2 around the frame and that bottom wire. And at this juncture, we need to be sure we don't pull them too tightly together. So you can use your fingertips if you need to, just to get access between the number 1 and the number 2 rod. Prise them apart as you need to. But again, don't pull too tightly together, because in a moment we're going to need access to just this frame wire. So scooch those over to the side, and then again you can open that gap out, push your wire down into position, pull that all the way down to the base, but not so tight that you then can't wrap 4 times around just that base wire. So let's just get that going all the way around. That's 1. That's 2. When you're pulling down like so, you need to make sure that you don't bend your base wire, your frame wire. So do just take care that you're supporting it as you pull the wire down. You'll notice I bring the wire down the back, and then I'm pushing up on that frame wire with my thumb as I'm pulling down with my thumb and forefinger. Then we're going to push those wires over so we get a nice tight wrap. So it doesn't look like overly much at the moment, but it will build up and it will be beautiful. So scooch everything all the way over, and then pull the tail of wire that's still connected to that reel out to one side. And what we're going to do is tighten up each of these little collections of weaving segments. So just make sure everything's nice and tidy, and then give it a really hearty squish. And this is the point in time that it starts looking like something you want to wear. So you can just tighten these up to make sure that there's no gaps and give them plenty of squishies. Now, before we go any further or continue along the way, we need to move the rods. So to do this, we're going to ensure that we're absolutely delighted with that first little mountain peak that we've created. Make sure that you're happy with how everything sits. You can practice with a slightly lighter wire to create this weave if you wish to, but you do need quite a strong wire when you're making a freestanding spike. So give that all a little bit of a squish. Once you've created your second peak and trough, what you will need to do is just pull these rods along. So up at the top, it's really easy to accidentally pull that rod or the section of wire out. All we're looking to do is to move it along a little bit. So just be controlled and pull that along bit by bit. So we're just supporting the very, very end of that spike at the moment. When you've done a second mountain like so, you'll do the same thing again. But before you're pulling your pins out of that segment of spike weave, you need to make sure that you have compressed it fully. What you will end up with is something like this. So as you move your way along, you will find that you do your little compressions, you tighten everything up. It's a little bit trickier to get everything neat and tidy once you've taken those rods out because you don't have support inside. And what you mustn't do is crush down on these freestanding spikes once you've removed the rods out of the game, because what will happen is you will crush them and then they won't be the same as what you're looking to achieve for today. So keep going until you've got the correct number of spikes that you want to see. Now I've added a bead on either end of my weave. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 spikes, which means I would need to have 11 beads. Maths is not my strong point. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yes. You'll need one more bead than spike. So it can take a little bit of practice just to get your weave neat. Often what can happen is you'll end up with a slightly twisted weave. It'll look a little bit like that, and all you'll need to do is just straighten that up. Another thing that you'll notice once you've removed the rods from your design, and as I say, do no more than 2 spikes at a time when you're working with a 0.6 or 22 gauge wire, purely because it becomes increasingly more difficult to remove those rods and you need them out of the weave. So rather than trying to get them out with a chainsaw later, just move them along and then pull them free after you've compressed each of those spikes on the rods. Another thing that you'll notice is that your spike weave only looks like a spike weave from one side. If you head back down to the board with me now, I'll show you what I mean. So you will end up with something like this. If it is at all twisty, you can just take a second to put a little bit of pressure into it and it will soon straighten up for you. On the front, you've got this stepped weave, which is 2 wraps around everything and then a gap of 4 between. But if you flip it over to the other side, it looks very different, and that's just the way that the weave works. So when we are adding in our beads and setting our pendant up, it does pay to just take a second look and make sure that you're facing that in the correct orientation. Now for the next section of the beaded spike weave shield pendant, you'll need a round form. Now I would say slightly on the side of smaller than you think you'll need, because this heavy wire will spring out. And what we're going to do is very, very slowly wrap around a round form so that you can start to get that circular motion going on. Now it might come out a little bit smaller than you want, which is absolutely fine, because we can open that out very, very gently. Let's just turn those tails over slightly so that we get to have this looking how we want it to. So again, just make sure that you're on the correct face of your weave, and I'm sure everything will be absolutely delightful. Now I'm leaving that slightly open at the back there because the next thing we're going to do is add in our wire with those beads. So the wire I'm going to use again is that 0.6mm or 22 gauge. You can go for 0.8 or 20 gauge at this stage, but as we're going to do a tiny bit of weaving with it just at the top here, I would suggest the 0.6, which is 22 gauge. So I'm just going to warm that first section up, and I'm not going to cut it away just yet until I get much more than I think I need. So probably you won't need much more than sort of 6 inches or so, but I'm going to take a lot more than I need just because it makes it easier when loading those beads on. So do make sure that that wire is nice and warm and smooth. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's freezing cold in my house, so the wire is being particularly unhelpful today. So what we're going to do is to start at one end of that section of spike weave. Now I did mention earlier not to crush down when these spike weaves become freestanding. What you can do is take that sideways and just tidy that up very, very softly if those have come apart whilst you're bending the wire round. So let's put the first section of wire through, and this is way more than I need. I probably only need about 7 or 8 inches of wire, but I've got a good 12 inches of wire just here. Then I'm going to add on one of my beads, and again I've gone for this beautiful vibrant dyed green onyx. I'm going to retract that all the way back so that only the very tip sticks out, and then I'm going to push that through the next section of upstanding spikes. Now you can do this when your beaded spike weave, when your spike weave section is straight, but what tends to happen is that you get uncomfortable kind of little dimples in the wire as it goes round. So I tend to do this after, which is just slightly more tricky because you have to kind of press that down and then push the wire through, but it is worth it because you get a much smoother finish on the design. So do just take your time and feed that through from the other end, and you will find that they do go through. So just push until that sits in the correct place. Little bit fiddly, all the way through the next peak of that spike. So keep going until you've gone all the way around, and then I'll show you in a moment where we move on to next. Tiny bit fiddly, but so totally worth it. Let's move on to the next stage, and then we'll finish off with a little bit of weaving, and I'll show you where you can find out how to make that Loki bale. So you can see we've got all of those beads loaded onto some wire in between the peak of each of those springs. If you need to, you can tighten up that spike weave section just a little bit, just by pushing it along. What we're going to do now is try to ignore these two little wires that are sticking out that carry the beads and the tips of the spike weave, and we're going to concentrate on putting some up bends on the heavy frame wire. So I'm just going to grip on one side and push that up at the 12 o'clock position, leaving as small a gap as possible. However, what you can do if you need to is push everything around so that it sits a little bit closer to that first bend, just compressing the spike weave as you go. What you'll then need to do is get as close as possible on the second side and just push that wire up again. It's a very strong wire I'm working with today, and as mentioned, it's very, very cold. So we want both of those two ends of the frame wire to sit up as straight as possible. So let's just give that a little bit of a wiggle until it sits where you want it to. And then we're going to draw both of those lighter wires, which are the bead carrying wires, so that they sit over the top of the design, and just gently bring them back into position. We need them to be a little bit straighter than I currently have them. So there we go. That looks pretty good to me at this time. So what we're going to do now is to add on a bead at the end of each of those wires. And I've got a couple spare. And yes, you'll have to forgive me, maths is not my strong point. It's just one bead more than the number of spikes you created. And I created 10 spikes, so I've got 11 beads. So I've popped one on the end there. What I need to do is just make sure that that bead sits down as close as possible to the spike weave. And then I'm going to bring that down over the side, the upright wire it's nearest to. Just take that down the centre, pull that all the way through, trying not to spike yourself. I know it's called a spike weave, but don't do that, it hurts. And just sit that in position for a second. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because I want to make sure that things are as symmetrical as possible. So a little bit of smoothing on the other side. Add in that final bead. Let's slide that down. Make sure it sits as close as possible to that spike. And then we'll bring the tail down between those two upright wires. Nice and close, like so. So they need to be as symmetrical as possible, so you might want to just pull the other side over so that they match as closely as you can get them. And then all I'm going to do here is about 3 wraps around the upright on both sides. So let's give that another turn. That's 2 and that's 3. And I'm just going to pull that out of the way for a hot second. Give that a little scooch. I'll do exactly the same thing on the second side. So that's 1, that's 2. There's a third visible wrap, and just pull that out of the way. Let's make sure that those are nice and tidy. And then what we're going to do next, you can see that the way this is sitting, because I'm pulling tight on the ends, we're starting to get a deviation in that outer ridge where the beads are loaded. That's exactly what we want it to do. But what we need it to do is to have that happening towards the rear so that we get this beautiful doming, making our shield shape. So make sure that that sits behind, and then you can tighten up if you need to just by pulling on those tails, making sure that you don't hurt your frame wire. And then exactly the same on the other side, just pull that until it sits nice and taut. Once those two are taut, we're going to do a little bit of a figure 8 weave up the centre, and then we'll finish off with a Loki bale. You can find out about figure of 8 weave just here. I'll pop a little note so that you can head off and find out how to do that in detail. But it's basically a case of wrap on 3 times on one side, over the top on one side, underneath on the other side. So I've just done about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches of that figure of 8 weave. I've used 0.5mm, which is 24 gauge, but you could use 0.4mm, which is 26 gauge, just to create that little bit of weave. Let's head back down to the board and we'll finish this pendant off. So the next thing I'm going to do is just tidy up some of these loose ends. So the two wire ends that travel through the beads and create the outside of that shield, I'm going to trim those to around about 1.5 inches and just create some little spirals. I might make it a little bit shorter actually, 1.25 inches. So I'm just going to add some spirals to that now. Let's start by rotating the wire around using either your round pliers, Bale makers or your memory wire finishing pliers, and just create a classic little spiral. Now if you don't want to use spirals in this design, you can just trim that wire away, but I kind of like them, so I'm going to put some just over the surface. I'll do exactly the same on the other side now. So like I said, you could use your round nose pliers or your Bale makers. I'm today using my memory wire finishing pliers just because it gives me the same size little round form in the middle every single time. Now you don't have to put the spirals on, you could have one on the front, one on the back if you wanted to, but I quite like how it reflects the roundness of the beads. So I'm just going to bring that as close as I can get it to that core wire and then just sit them down towards the centre. So you can mess around with how they sit, but I'm just going to leave them like that for now. I might change my mind and trim them away later, but there's just one idea. I don't like them crossing over, so I'm just going to open that out slightly until they sit a little bit further apart. That's better. So to create the Loki Bale, I'm going to put a video link up here now. You don't obviously have to go for the Loki Bale. It's one of my favourite fast finish pieces, but you can pop off and do any kind of Bale that you fancy. You could even just create a loop and then draw those tails into the last little bit, those last little angles just at the back, which will be neatly hidden by the spirals we've just created. Before you go anywhere further, you do need to just make sure that both of those ends are the same length, and then finish off your Bale however you want to. So I finished off my little Loki Bale there, and I put those spirals in different places because I didn't really like how they sat. That's the beauty of adding a spiral to a piece like this. You can just play with it till it looks good. So I'll take a photograph of the two pieces side by side and leave it as an outro. I hope that you've enjoyed today's tutorial. Please don't forget to share the content if you're enjoying it so that it can be seen by the wider community. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.